Awesome, everybody. So, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I used to be a meetup junkie. Well, first, a little bit about me. I'm Eli Lucas. I work for a company called Ionic, where I do software development and dev advocate stuff, like coming to meetups and speaking at meetups and conferences and writing blogs and stuff like that about the stuff that I built at Ionic, which is really awesome. Yeah, like I said, I used to be a meetup junkie. Coming to a whole bunch of meetups, and I'm really excited to be here at the Node one because this would be one that I would come to all the time I could. But then this happened, right? Had all these kids, and they just keep me so busy, and so now it's been a little hard to try to convince my wife to be like, hey, can I go hang out and nerd out with a bunch of other developers and watch a presentation and stuff? She's like, no. I'm like, well, what happens if I go out and speak? And she's like, well, okay. And so that's how I get out here to the meetups nowadays. So yeah, I got 4 kids, and they're great. Sometimes they're like this. Most of the time they're like this, but they're pretty awesome. I love them. To give you a little bit of background about myself, so I've been doing software development for around 20 years now. And I got started off doing Microsoft.NET stuff. And this is back late 90s, early 2000s, back when the web was really the wild, wild west, and it was really hard to do web development. So I really tried to stay away from doing any type of front-end development or JavaScript development, because it was just really hard back then. You had the browser wars going on between Internet Explorer, Netscape Navigator, and all that kind of stuff, and you had to write JavaScript 2 different ways. And so I did lots and lots of server-side development, server render views, that kind of stuff through ASP, ASP.NET, and all the .NET technologies. Kind of grew up as a Microsoft developer throughout my career. But lately, especially around the time that jQuery came out, I got interested in doing front-end development again. And that's just because jQuery kind of normalized the browsers for you. You didn't have to program to all these different APIs anymore. You could program to one API. And it made front-end development actually enjoyable again. And then, so jQuery was really awesome. We owe a whole lot to jQuery and what it's done, even though it's not what you're going to go out and reach for nowadays as far as thinking about what you're going to build. You're probably going to look at something like a React or an Angular or Vue or something like that, but we definitely owe a lot to jQuery. Then after jQuery, I kind of started getting into these other, what we would call JavaScript frameworks. So these were trying to standardize what it meant to build a client-side application using JavaScript. So Backbone, Knockout, Kendo, these were all different, what you could call almost MVC frameworks for client-side development. But it's when these two came out, Angular and React, that I really got into front-end client-side development and kind of started doing it full-time. So that kind of means I left the server-side world, I left the .NET world for a few years and wasn't doing a whole lot of .NET stuff. But then I started at a company, and they were like, okay, we have all these JavaScript engineers, and our backend at the time was Java. And they're like, we have all these JavaScript engineers that are doing front-end development. We need to do something on the backend as well. So we got together as a team. It's like, well, what about Node, right? We got JavaScript developers who write a Node in JavaScript, and so we can kind of utilize our skill set there to write JavaScript on both the backend and the front end. And we're like, yeah, that's kind of a good idea. Let's you got to try it. And so we started it, and we're creating a bunch of different Node services, a bunch of microservices for this application. It got me back into doing server-side development again. I realized I really missed it, but what I didn't, what I really missed about it was that Node was kind of almost like the Wild Wild West again. So we're using Express, and Express is a really great framework. You can do a lot of stuff with it, but I found kind of when you write an Express app, you can go one of two ways. And this is kind of because Express really doesn't offer any type of guidance on how to structure a Node app. And so it could either go one way, where it's just a bunch of spaghetti code all over the place. You're writing route handlers and 1,000-line functions to handle it, and that's no fun. Or you can get somebody who's a really good architect in there and kind of separate things out into nice design patterns and whatnot. And that was really great. But the problem with that was that particular pattern didn't translate from project to project or from company to company. And so every time you went to go look into a different Express app, you kind of had to like learn it all again. Even though it's JavaScript, even though it's Express, you kind of have to learn like what's going inside the particular project. And so that was a little difficult. And I was like, how could this be better? There must be something out there. And at the time, like Angular 2 was coming on the scenes and TypeScript was coming out. And I always felt myself to be a pretty good JavaScript developer. And when TypeScript was first announced, I was kind of like, okay, TypeScript's not for me. It's Microsoft trying to say like, hey, C# devs, it's okay to come over and write JavaScript with your types and stuff like that. And so I kind of ignored it for a while. But when I started doing Angular 2 development, using TypeScript full time, I absolutely just fell in love with TypeScript. So quick show of hands, like who's doing like TypeScript right now? Who's doing TypeScript? Keeping the hands up. Who's doing TypeScript on the server side? Awesome. All those hands stayed up. That's really good to see. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to create a TypeScript framework for Node that could give me these patterns and practices that I was used to using in the .NET world inside of ASP.NET MVC, but bring those patterns over there. And so I started to search for something that was kind of like that, or that would let me get there. And that's how I discovered Nest. And so, quick show of hands, who's heard of Nest? Okay, about half the audience. Anybody using Nest? All right, we got one person using Nest. And so, Nest is another web framework for Node. Kind of like Express, except it's not really a brand new web framework, because underneath the covers, by default, Nest does use Express to do its thing. But what Nest is, it's more of a platform, and it offers a certain set of opinionated ways that you do things. And this is good because now that you have these opinions, it offers that guidance that you need to be like, okay, I have this logic to write. I know exactly like where this piece of logic is going to go, where that piece of logic is going to go, and whatnot, versus trying to figure out somebody else's architecture. So it's a web framework, so you can use it to write server-rendered web applications. You can use it to create an API for any type of other applications that you need it to talk to. It could be used for microservices. It could be used to create a GraphQL server, a real-time communications server using WebSockets and Socket.io. And so even though it's like this really opinionated framework, it doesn't limit you in what you can do with it. So you can pretty much take Nest and use it for all these different things. Really, what Nest is, it's a framework to write Node applications using TypeScript with certain opinionated practices. And so it's really similar to other types of enterprise backend servers like ASP.NET MVC, Java Spring, servers like that. So if you're coming from one of those types of camps, it's really going to feel similar to you. But one of Nest's main goals was to actually make it easier for front-end developers to get into back-end development. And the way that they did that is that they really mirrored how Angular was doing things on the server side. They or on the client side, they took that and they kind of made it inside of Nest as well. So there's a lot of similar concepts between Angular and Nest, almost to the point where people can say like Nest is like writing Angular on the server, which I don't particularly agree with, because if you think about how Angular came about, Angular came from hardcore Java developers wanting client-side development to be more like their backend development. And so even though Nest kind of mimicked Angular, what they're really doing is mimicking the other server-side frameworks that were already out there. But it comes to like, if you're an Angular developer, you're going to find a lot of concepts inside of Nest immediately familiar, a lot of the namings and stuff. If you're not an Angular developer, no need to worry about it, because Nest is, like I said, it's a Node framework that you can use, and you don't have to use Angular with it. So just like in a nutshell, it has a pretty wicked awesome kitty logo, which is very important. And Yeah, this is kind of how it explains itself. A progressive node framework for building efficient, reliable, and scalable server-side applications. And so these are the building blocks. These are the pieces of opinionated pieces that Nest has inside of it. And so if you are an Angular developer, you're going to find these names familiar. But if you're not, don't worry. We're actually going to go over all of these in the presentation tonight. And like I said before, it's not just for Angular devs. In fact, I'm mainly a React developer, and I still love Nest. When I was trying to learn Nest, I discovered something about it. This is the documentation, and by the way, they have really great docs. But if you take a look up in the top left-hand corner, you're actually going to see a hamburger icon. And so they actually used a hamburger icon for their hamburger menu. And when I saw this, I knew it was the framework for me. Right. All right, anyways. All right, let's talk about the application that we're going to build tonight. And so typically, like what you would see in a presentation like this is like a to-do application, right? And that's not all that cool. They're a little boring, a little out of date. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create an app, and we're going to call it Ghost Space Ranger. All right. And what Ghost Space Ranger is going to do, it's going to allow Space Rangers to take a look at a list of jobs that are available to them, be able to mark them as complete, and add new ones and delete them. All right, I know what you're thinking. It's just a to-do app for Space Rangers. But it's much more awesome than that because, we have Space Rangers, and we're going to have Space Kittens. And this is going to be a little example of what the app is going to look like using Nest as our backend here. And if you have any questions, feel free to kind of go ahead and interrupt me and ask away. I kind of like these to be conversations and whatnot. But in this demo, I'll give you an idea of what we're going to cover. So we're going to kind of create a little bit of a REST API that's going to allow us to get what we're going to call missions, get single missions, create new missions, update missions, delete missions, and then we're going to see how to do a little bit of validation and authentication inside of Nest as well. I'm going to sit down now, and sometimes when I sit down, my voice kind of gets a little bit lower, so like especially like in the back, if I ever drown out, just let me know and I'll speak up again. All right, so, I killed the slide on how to get started with Nest. And so I'll just show you here real quick. And so Nest, being a node-based project, what you do is you install it. And so you say npm i-g, let me make that bigger so we can see it, and @nest CLI. And this is going to install the Nest command line interface. Yeah, question?
I think the projector is either frozen.
I need to mirror my screen. Hold on. There we go. Thank you. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger, and I will kill the side. All right, can we see that okay in the back? Awesome. Okay, so this will install. I already have it installed, so I'm not going to run it. Plus, it might take a while because it's going out to the internet and space and back to download half the npm along with it. But this is going to give you the Nest CLI, and the Nest CLI is what you're going to use to kick off new applications, to run your application. Also includes a nice set of generators that you can use to build new controllers, services, anything that you want to build with Nest. If you're an Angular developer and you use the Angular CLI, it's actually very similar. It's actually built off of the Angular CLI. But then to start a new Nest application, what you do is you say Nest new, and then give it a name like blah. And this is going to create a new application for you. I already ran that here, so I'm not going to do it again. But this is our pretty close to basic. Let me kill that and start it back up again.
So code dot that starts in the IE,
So this is Visual Studio Code right here that I'm using, and so you can install the command line way to kick off code. And so code dot says open up Visual Studio Code in this current directory, which is what I have here. Okay, so let's go a quick tour of what you get inside of a new Nest app. And so by default, Nest is going to use TypeScript. And that's one of the things that really drew me to it. And it not only just does it use TypeScript to like help give you stuff, but it actually uses it for functionality wise, which I'll show you a little bit later. So while you can use Nest without TypeScript, you can just use JavaScript. I highly recommend using it with TypeScript. It's kind of like if you do Angular without TypeScript, there's a lot of extra stuff that you have to do along with it. Kind of the same deal with Nest. But up here, we got our source folder, and then we have the main application module. And this is the entry point into your application. This is where everything's configured. So here we'll list all of our controllers. And so controllers are what are responsible to listening to incoming HTTP requests and then responding out with responses to those HTTP requests. And we have providers. So these are two concepts that come directly from the Angular world. Providers is how we set up our dependency injection inside of a Nest app. And so if we have a controller, we can actually inject other services and classes and stuff into it. And that's good for like testing purposes and decoupling your application code and whatnot. And then right here, so we have this app controller. And so this decorator right here, this app controller, is telling the Nest framework like, hey, this controller is going to listen to HTTP requests. And by default, there's no parameter passed into here. And so this is going to listen to the root URL if you don't pass in anything in here. And then we have this get hello method right here. And this get hello method has this get decorator on it. And so what this is telling us is like, hey, if a get request comes in, this is the method that's going to respond to it. And so it's going to call get hello, and then we're going to have our app service, and it's going to call the get hello method on the app service. And this get hello method is just going to return back hello world. And so I'm going to launch the server using an npm command. And so this is going to be npm run start debug. And this is going to start, going to create the server for us. It's going to have a watcher on it, so it'll recompile anytime I make a code change, a file change. It's going to recompile the app, and it's also going to start it up in debug mode, because if I'm here inside Visual Studio Code and I want to check out the debugging, I can come over here to the debug and I can add a configuration, and I'll add another one, and I'll call it attach. And so this will attach to a current node process that's currently running debug. And so I can do that, and now I can come over here. Let's minimize this a little bit. Oh, what's happening there? Attach, go. There we go. And so I can come over here into the controller and I can set a breakpoint here. And now I'm going to use Postman. Anybody not familiar with what Postman does? So Postman I can use to make HTTP requests back and forth to my server. And so, let's see if I can make that bigger. And so here, I'll just make a HTTP request. This is where it's running the localhost port 3000. And if I hit send, you can see I come in here, I hit my breakpoints. I'm just going to go ahead and let it continue right now. We'll do a little bit more debugging later. But now it outputs out the hello world. And so if I go back into my service where this data is coming from, I'll just say hello world 2222, hit save. Here in the background, it already recompiled itself. And come over here and hit send again. Oh, why did you not? All right, hold on a second. I think I got something weird going on with some cached files. Let me kill this folder. And start this back up again. There we go. Hopefully it doesn't happen again, but if so, we'll get through it. Okay, and so the first thing I want to do for our Go Space Ranger app is I want to create a new endpoint that's going to give us back a list of missions. And so to do that, we'll come over here, I'll open up a new command line terminal, and I'll use the CLI to create a controller for us. And so I'll say nest g controller missions. And this created the controller for us. And while I'm here, I'm also going to create a service. And if you're not familiar with the MVC architecture, what we're doing here is typically in the MVC architecture, you have your controllers which listen to the HTTP requests. You want to keep those as small and as clean as possible, and you want to put like any type of other types of logic elsewhere. And so we use services to put that other type of logic. So in our app, we're going to use our service to query a database, to talk back and forth to the database, and the controller will talk back and forth to the service.
So it's more of like the service is equivalent to the model?
No, because we'll use a model as well, but a service is just another layer that's inside of your app. And so up here, let me kill this real quick because I didn't call it missions. And so if we go back and take a look at the app module file, we'll get rid of this one. But the nice thing about using the Nest CLI is it kind of wires everything up for you. And so it already added our missions controller to the list of controllers for us, and it also added the mission service to the list of providers for us. And so now in this mission service, what I'm going to do to start off is I'm going to create just use a hard-coded array of some missions to go on. For right now, we'll turn this into a database call in a moment. And then I'm going to make a method, and we'll call it get, we'll just call it get all. And for right now, we're just going to return this missions array. Now inside of our missions controller, and so you can see up here we have this controller directive again, but now it has missions, and this is going to be the path that it listens to HTTP requests at. So it's going to be localhost port 3000/missions. That's what that's saying. And then we're going to use that get decorator to let Nest know that we're going to listen to a get request here. And we'll just say get. And then we need to call into that service. And so we need to get access to that service. And we're going to use Nest dependency injection system to get that. And so we're going to inject that through the constructor. And so what's going on right here, this is one of the places that Nest is using TypeScript to help it. And so we are telling it that we want a type of mission service. And so because we're using TypeScript, it knows this is when it goes to find something to resolve this, it's gonna be like, hey, I need something that is of type mission service, and hey, your missions class is of that type. So it's going to create a new mission service and inject it into this class when it creates it for us. And then we'll, right now, I'll just kind of do a call through this .mission service .get all. And looks like it recompiled good. Come back over here to Postman. And so now if I go to /missions, I'll get back an array of missions that come back. So that's well and good, but we don't typically have all of our data hard-coded inside of our services classes, right? We typically go out and either call another API or a database or something like that. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call into a Postgres database, and I'm going to use an ORM mapping library, so object relational mapping. It's a library that's going to allow me to communicate to the database, and it's also going to do stuff like create the database automatically for me and manage all of its entities inside of it and whatnot. So this particular project is called Type ORM, and coming from the .NET world, I find this very similar to the entity framework. It's pretty awesome. Let me show you how it works real quick. But I'll create a new folder here, and I'll just call it models. And I'll create a mission.entity model and paste this guy in here. And so this is my model. And so type ORM is going to use decorators again to help it, but based on the particular values of it. So right here I have the ID. I'm saying that it's a number. And with this decorator, I'm saying this is the primary generated column. And so when it goes to create the database for us, it's going to make this its primary key. Same thing right here. So I got a title with a type of string with a length of 125. So I'll create a column inside the database with a string with the length of 125, and so on and so on. Now, in order to use this inside of Nest, I'll come over here to the module, and I need to set it up. And I'll paste this guy in here, and let me get that import. It's not going to do it for me, is it? No. Let me import that real quick from @NestJS /type ORM. Okay, and so this is the connection string that it needs to be able to talk to the database. And so this is a Postgres database. Type ORM can talk to a whole bunch of different databases out there, mostly relational, but it can talk to a few different NoSQL databases as well. And this is running on my local computer on its default port. The username and the password to get into it. This is how I do all my passwords, so please don't try to remember it. The database it's going to talk to, and then like this path to where all the entities are going to be. And so it was important you notice that I named my entity mission.entity. That's what it's looking for right here, because when it starts up, it's going to go look for all those entities, talk to the database, and see if it needs to either create the database or update the database or whatever it needs to do to get it into sync with my models. And so if I let that go, make sure it compiles and runs.
Does it store migrations?
It will do migrations, yes. Okay, now over here. And so if I come over here and I hit refresh on this table here, you can see I now have a missions table with all those columns that were on my model. Went ahead and created this for me, and I'm ready to start writing queries against it. I got a SQL statement ready to go up here to add. Well, I'll just query it real quick so you can see that there's nothing in the database right now because it's brand new. But I'll go ahead and add one of the missions to it. Now, in order to use this, instead of calling into or just returning back that hard-coded array, we're going to inject a repository. And so a repository is kind of like a typed object that lets me actually physically talk to the database. Not that guy. That guy. Instructor. Get all these imports in. And so this is what I'm doing here is I'm creating an object called missions repository. And this is just a little bit of glue that it needs to be able to match up my entity with the particular repository that I'm using. And the last thing I need to do for the database work is I need to import the entity here. Now, instead of calling return.thismissions, I should be able to call into my repository. And say find, and this will go ahead and find all the records in the database and return them. So if we give that a go, and if everything went good, I can come here and say go. Oh, and it's empty. Oh, it's because my insert didn't succeed for some reason. Let me see why. Oh, I no longer have it is deleted column. There we go. Insert succeeded. So now if I come over here and query the API, I got that as well. And so this is going to return me back a list of missions. Let's see what it's like to actually specify a parameter to return back a particular mission inside our nest. And so to do that, we'll go back to the controller, and we will create another method, and we'll use the get decorator again, but this time we're going to specify a string in here. We're going to say :/id, and this is going to be the last part of the URL. So we're already going to /missions, and so now we're going to go to like /missions/1, and that value of 1 is going to be the value of this ID that's getting passed in. So we'll just say get mission. And so you can say ID number, and now what you need to do is you need to tell Nest where the value is coming from. And so it's going to come from a param, and so we'll use this param decorator, and then give it the name of the param that it's coming from. You can say this .mission service .get mission ID. And this method doesn't exist yet, so we'll go create it. Inside the mission service, get mission ID, and we'll make sure it's a number. So we'll say this .mission repository .find one. So we want to make sure we're only returning one particular record here, and pass it in that ID. You know, so I'll hit the missions again, get back the array, but now if I go and just say /1, I should just get back the single record. It's the only one I got in my database right now, but if I try to specify another ID right here, you'll see nothing comes back. We'll fix this here in a few minutes to make sure that comes back with an actual 404 not found method instead of 200 OK. But if we come back here and we look at this, we got the main data on our mission object is like the title, the reward, and if it's active or not. We got some other metadata here on this object as well. And this is data that's important to like our database, our admin people, our security people. It's not necessarily stuff that we want to return back to the front end. And so we want to be able to like pull that out of the model before we actually send it through the wire. And so one way that we could do that here in the controller, I can actually get access to the mission before I send it out, and so I'll get it here. These methods are all, they all return promises, and so I'm going to await on it. So I actually get back the real mission object. And so now I can say like return ID equals mission.id, title equals mission.title, and reward is mission.reward. So I can do that, and it will work. So now it's only returning back those particular fields, but there's a few problems with this method. First problem is if I ever add on objects to the mission entity, I'm gonna have to make sure to go back here and include them, right? Also, this particular mapping logic is only here. If I go back to the list emissions, it's not being applied. And so I want to make sure that my code is nice and clean and simple as possible, right? And so to do that, Nest gives us a facility, and we can use another library to automatically pull those things out and have Nest make sure that all requests go through that particular mechanism.
Good question. You mentioned that the method, all these methods return a promise. What
Yep.
exactly?
So are you familiar with the concept of promises?
Yes.
Okay, and so the repository right here, this right here is returning back a promise.
Okay.
And so because the promise is being returned from the service, it's also what is being returned from these controllers. And the nice thing about Nest is it doesn't matter if it's synchronous or asynchronous, if it's a promise or not, Nest is automatically going to handle it for you. You normally don't have to await the promises and then return it. You can actually just return the promise and it will do it for you. No. So there's this other library, and I already have it installed, so you don't have to see me install some new libraries. But I got two of them here that I'll talk about real quick, and they are Class Transformer, which is what I'm going to use now, and another one that I'm going to use a little bit called Class Validator. I like to call these libraries friends of Nest because they're TypeScript libraries as well that use decorators very heavily, and so they feel very natural when you're using them inside of Nest itself. So what we'll do is we'll go over here to the entity model, and it's already in here. So this exclude method right here, what this is saying, see, exclude is being brought in from the Class Transformer package, but what it's doing is it's excluding these particular fields right here. You can see it's not working yet because we're not currently running it through Class Transformer. To do so, we'll see how to do it quick and dirty here. We can say return, and there's this method called class2plane, and we'll pass in the mission to it. And class2plane came from the Class Transformer library up here. And what this is going to do, it's going to take a class and it's going to convert it to a plain JavaScript object. And it's going to take a look at any of those decorators that are on that object. And if it sees like special commands for it, like the exclude decorator, it's going to do what it's told to do. So in this particular case, it's going to exclude those fields. So now if I let that run, and let's say I think I was on the get by ID, yeah. There we go. Now we can see that it's excluding those fields, and we didn't have to do the mapping for us. Yeah, question?
Are there like different contexts? So if you wanted to return different values for like the list versus the detail?
So if I wanted to return back different values depending on the type of call, I think you could probably do that. I'm gonna get into a section right there, and I think it might answer your question there. Okay, so this took care of the problem of if I ever add stuff to my mission entity, it's automatically going to be taken care of. But what it's not being taken care of is I have to kind of go and repeat this code all over the place that I'm returning missions, right? So I'll have to repeat it up here in this get method as well. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to use a facility of Nest called a interceptor. And an interceptor will take a look at, it's kind of like a pipeline. And so a request comes in, it's going to hit your controller. Your controller is going to grab its values from the services and whatnot. It's going to send it back out. You can use an interceptor at that point in time to grab that value after it leaves the controller, and you can do special stuff with it before it actually goes back out to the client. And so we'll create a new interceptor. So say NestG interceptor, and I'll just call it data because I am not very creative. And if I go look at that particular class now, and so we got this intercept method, and so we got the execution context, which gives us particular information about the current execution, so like the URLs and verbs that are coming back and all that kind of stuff. The next call, which is if this is a pipeline, so I could have multiple interceptors and multiple things sitting inside of this particular thing. It's kind of like express middleware. So the next is going to call the next one in line. But what this is, so this is an RxJS observable. And if you're an Angular developer, you're very familiar with this. If you're not an Angular developer, this is probably something that's like really foreign. But an observable is like a stream. And so this is a stream going through our particular request, and we're going to intercept it and then change it on its way out. And so to do that, what we'll do is we'll call the pipe operator to add into the pipeline here. And then we'll use a operator called map. And I have to go here and insert it here real quick. Operators, lower M. And so this map is very similar to a map on like a JavaScript array or something like that. It's going to take particular value, map it into something else, and then return it. And so we'll say data, and then here we'll say return. And this is where we will run the class to plane now. And we'll pass that data through it. So once again, request is coming in, it's going to my controller, the controller is grabbing the database object, sending it back out. This interceptor is intercepting that call. This data is going to be that particular mission object. I'm going to run that through the class to plane and then return it and have it go on its way. And we will get rid of this and just return that mission now. And now that I have the data interceptor class, I have to tell Nest where I want to use it. And there's a few different ways that you can do that. I can use a decorator here, and I can call it use interceptors, and I can pass it into here. And so it will run on this one particular method if I do it like this. If I move this decorator up to the class level, right here, it will run it on the whole class. But I can also run it application-wide. And to run it application-wide, what you do is you go into the app module, and then you set it up here in the providers. And this syntax looks a little funky, and so I'll go through it slowly. But what you do is you say provide, and then you give it a token. And this token is a string, and it's going to come from the Nest library. And so I'm going to say interceptor in this case. And then I'm going to tell it to use the class of data interceptor. And so throughout the pipeline, the Nest framework is going to be like, hey, are there any, is there anything set up for me in the providers to provide this particular class? And if so, use it. So that's what we're doing here. So we're saying when you ask for an interceptor, give it one of our data interceptors. And give that a second to compile. There we go. So we can see it's working on the get by single request. And now we can see it's also working on the get all, which is returning back the array. So that's pretty cool, but there's a lot of different things that you can do with data interceptors. You can use it for logging, and so you can like log before a request happens, log after a request happens. You can also use this to transform your objects in general. So a lot of the times you might have a certain schema that your responses should adhere to, right? And so we can set that up here. So we can say we want to return back, let's say we have a data property that our data actually sits on. And we have other fields that are like metadata. So we could do something like up here. What happens before the return is before it goes to the controller. What happens inside of the pipe happens after it comes out of the controller. And so I can get the time before, get the time after, and minus those two and see how long our request took to go. And so I could say const start equals date dot now to get the time before it starts, and then down here I could say const and equals date dot now, and here I could have an interval, and I could say end minus start, and we'll return that object. So now I'm totally changing the schema that's being returned from the controller and turning it something that I want it to be more like universal, that all my calls are going to adhere to. You can also use it, so I talked about earlier, like how if we call an ID that doesn't exist, and so we're getting back, it's still a 200, but no actual data. I can take a look at the object here. I could say, hey, if data is undefined, I can return, or I can throw a, not an actual A, throw not found exception. And when I do this, now I can get a 404 when it's actual not found, when the object isn't coming back from the database, right? Or when it is, I still get my main object. So yeah, that's interceptors. They're really powerful. You can do lots of stuff with it. But it also shows you like it's a really good place that Nest gives you. Like I said, Nest is an opinionated framework. So when you have logic like this, okay, I have logging logic, or I'm going to transform data or do something like this, instead of like putting that all throughout your controllers, this gives you the particular place to put it where it's in one place and it can be reused everywhere. All right, so next let's see how to create some data. And so we'll go back over to the mission service. And let's see, I got all these ready to paste in. And so this here is pretty simple. I'm taking in a mission, and I'm just calling into the repository and saying save on it. Now over back in the controller, we're going to use a new verb here. And so now we're going to use a post for creating data. And so this is going to be when a post request comes in, this is going to be the method that listens to it. So we'll just call this create. And what we'll do is we'll pass in the mission, give it a type mission entity, and then say return this dot mission service dot create, and pass in that mission. Make sure that gets imported. Okay, so over here on this tab, I have a mission ready to go. So if I hit send here, oh, you can see I got back a 500 error, internal server error. Now, if you ever get back an error like this, if you're not logging it, it's always going to show up, especially during development time, it's going to show up here in the console. So if we go over here and look, we can say, cannot save, given value must be an entity, instead undefined is given. Oh, that's not what I expected, but I know what's causing it. And that's because I didn't tell Nest where this mission is coming from. I need to tell it that it's coming from the body. So the body of the request, it's going to map it to this particular object. So now I can actually go and see the error I was expecting. We can see we get a null value in the column created date, violates a non-null constraint. So this is an error that's coming back from the database. And what it's saying is that I'm not providing a created date, which you told me was a requirement in your entity setup. So if we go back and look at the entity, this created date right here, I didn't mark it as nullable or anything like that. And so it's saying like, hey, this is required, but why is it not coming in here? Well, because what we're doing here is we're lying to Nest by saying that this object that's coming in is of type mission entity. Really, this is just a plain JavaScript anonymous object. that's coming in with the values that we provided. In fact, if I hit a breakpoint here, and if we take a look at this request, hover over it, you can see it's just active reward and title. It's missing the created at and last updated by fields that are required. So why is this? Because it's just an anonymous object that we're sending in. But we can use Nest to automatically create this object for us. And this is through another mechanism called pipes. And pipes are another piece of middleware that sits somewhere in the pipeline, but they're more for like listening to requests before they get to your controllers, where data interceptors are more for doing stuff as they're leaving as data's leaving your controllers. And so I'll create a new pipe. I'll say an SG pipe data again, back to my originality comment. And if we take a look at the data pipe, you can see we just have this transform value. What I'll do is just delete that one and put in a new one. Import this plain to class. So this is another part where Nest is using the power of TypeScript to be able to do some really awesome things for you. And so generally, this right here, this mission entity, usually this isn't a part of the JavaScript that gets outputted. Like the TypeScript compiler is going to pull out all the typing information, but we have an option turned on here inside the TS config called emit decorator metadata. And so what this is going to do with all of our objects is going to attach a little bit of metadata to it that says like, hey, this mission was actually of type mission entity. And here inside of our pipe, we can get access to that, and we can use the class transformer to convert our normal plain JavaScript object into an actual class object. And so this type right here in our particular case is going to be of type mission entity, and this value is the anonymous JavaScript object. I'll go ahead and set a breakpoint here so we can see what it looks like going through. Oh, but first I need to add the pipe to the pipeline, and we can do it the same way that we did the interceptor through the providers here. So this time we'll say app pipe and use class data pipe. Hit F5 to start my debugger. And so now if I hover over this meta type, we can see that it is of class mission entity. And it's pulling that from that TypeScript metadata that's there. And here in this plain to class, so this value is just the plain JavaScript object. You can see up top here, it's just saying it's an object. But once we get this object out of it, we can see it's now our mission entity. And so what this is doing, it's newing up a new mission entity, and it's copying over any values from the plain JavaScript object onto our new object for us. It's going to pass it back through the pipeline. And then when it gets to our controller, it's going to be of actual type mission entity. And there we go. Now we have a successful 201 created error code or status code that came back. Any questions on that? Sweet. All right, let's take a look. So up here we have title, and this is another field that we have marked as required in our entity. And so if I take it out and hit send, and I'm gonna go ahead and stop the debugger here. You can see I'm getting another internal server error, and this one is a very similar error. It's basically a null constraint error saying that hey, title is required. Well, in this particular case, it's the client that's doing something wrong, not the server that's doing something wrong. And so we need to be able to tell the client that we're doing something wrong. And typically what you do there is you throw back a 400 bad request status code, right? And so what we can do here is we can use pipes again, and we can use another library called class validator. which is very similar to Class Transformer. You set it up with a bunch of decorators on your model to tell it validation rules that you want it to run on your particular models. And so we'll go look at the entity. And what we want to do is we'll start here with title, and we'll say we'll say that we want this to be a string. And so we want to say is string. This does not come from util. This comes from class validator. So we're going to say is string, so to make sure that the title coming in is a string, and we're also going to say is defined to make sure that it's actually coming in, that we're not just leaving it undefined. Here we'll say is number, and is defined as well. Oh no, this one is nullable, and so we'll say is optional. And then the active Boolean, we'll say is a Boolean. And we'll say is defined. And so the creators of Nest knew this was going to be such a common scenario that they actually include a validation pipe for you. So you could write your own, but we can use Nest validation pipe, and what that will do is it will run, it's another pipe like our data pipe that we just set up, and so it's going to run before the request, and it's going to check all these validation rules for us. And if any of them don't pass, it's going to create a nice error object and return it back. And so we'll add that here to the module. And so this will be another pipe. And so you can see we can actually have multiple things here. So we're going to define two pipes. They just run in order. So we'll say use class of validation pipe. And this validation pipe comes from the NestJS common library. Now, if we let that compile and go, you can see here, instead of getting back that 500 server error that was not very useful to us, we're now getting back a 400 error, and it's giving us a lot of good metadata about what exactly was wrong with our request. So we can see here that the property that caused the error was title, and these are the two constraints that it didn't pass. It didn't pass on the is defined or the is string one. And so I can also come up here, I can add title back in if I pass in like a number instead. Now it's going to pop up and say, like, you know, title must be a string. All right, and then to finish out our CRUD methods for update and delete, we'll run through this here real quick. It's really nothing new that you haven't seen yet. And so we got the update. We're taking in the ID and the entity because the update method will first take in the ID and then the entity that you want to update it with, and it will update it inside the database. And the delete method, we're just taking in the ID and calling delete on it. And over here in the controller, get those guys imported. So you can see here that it's mostly stuff that we've already seen. One thing that's a little bit different is here we are taking in the ID as a parameter from the URL. But over here, we're also taking in the mission from the body as a part of the put request. And so if I go over here to Postman and over here to the put, I can call this takeout space trash 2. Let that go. And if I come back over here and request it again, you can see that it was updated. And if I delete it, see it was deleted. And now I'm requesting the one, it's not there anymore. If I request the list, it should return back an empty array. Oh, I had another one in there as well. All right, so let's see. I think I'm just about out of time here, so I think I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. I'll post this demo app up on GitHub, so you can take a look at it. The one thing I didn't get time to get access to was authentication, but that's another piece of middleware called guards that we'll go through. And when I post the application up to GitHub, if you want to take a look at it, it will have the full demo app. I'll post a link to it up on the Meetup site tomorrow morning. But yeah, that's Nest. Go ahead and throw up a couple of resource slides here for you. Maybe. There we go. So the best place to go is the Nest website to get started, documentation and whatnot of that they got. Like I said, really great documentation, really great tutorials to go through and get you started. I've also written a blog series about creating a full stack Ionic / Angular application with Nest, and so you can go to the website and check it out. If you ever have any questions for me, you can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Eli Lucas, or if you're on the Denver Dev Slack, you can find me there as well at Eli Lucas. So any closing questions? Yeah.
What has been your biggest challenge in working with Nest?
What is the biggest challenge in working with Nest? I would say, so I've used TypeORM to do some more complex entity relationships where there's many-to-many relations and one-to-many relations and stuff like that. And probably while not necessarily directly related to Nest, those were a lot of work to get it set up properly. And then just to figure out like how am I going to pass the data into the API and not with it. I would say I have tried to create a real-time communication server using WebSockets through it, and that was probably a little bit more difficult than what it needed to be. I also find they offer a whole bunch of pre-baked middleware as well, and so if like you're doing something like passport authentication, JOT authentication, or something like that, there's usually a Nest package for it. I've often found it easier just to write it myself, because usually it's only like 10-15 lines of code anyways, and so trying to figure out like how to set up that special piece of middleware versus just doing it myself, I've often gone and done it myself. Yeah.
When you were setting up the providers and intersectors, you configured them to run for every route on the app, right?
Yeah. So when you set those up in the main app module, that is app wide that they're going to run through.
So like let's say you had an app that was 80% in API but 20% integrated into your responses. Can you sort of like say that I want these providers to run on this prefix like URL?
Yeah, so what I would probably do there, so that module, that was just one module. You could break your app up into multiple modules. And so you can have one module that just does your server rendered stuff, and another module that does your API stuff. And yeah, and then you can do the providers separately. So you wouldn't put the providers in the main app module like I did here. You'd put them in your individual modules, and that should set that up properly. Was that your main question earlier? Okay, great. Yeah, right.
This seems awfully lot like some other frameworks. What do you think this is the most likely you've seen before?
So I used to do lots and lots of ASP.NET MVC Web API. So this feels very familiar to me in that regards. Especially Web API was very similar, and like with the controllers, the services, dependency injection, using the decorators to set up your routes and whatnot. So it's very similar to that.
Yeah, I use that and service stack on there and all those basic sentences.
Yeah. Yep.
Question from the chat. Does NestJS support server-side rendering?
Does NestJS support server-side rendering? So definitely a yes for Angular apps. I think there's actually a Nest module that you can use to pull in ng universal. into it to do the server-side rendering. I am not quite so sure about React server-side rendering or Vue server-side rendering to get like Next or Next to play nicely with them. Do you have some insights?
Module that works with Next.
Oh, awesome. You said Next or Next?
Next.
Next, yeah. So Next, so we're doing Vue server-side rendering. And I would have to imagine if there's one for Vue, there's probably one for React as well.
All right, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming down. I really appreciate it, and have a great night.